There was a girl named Lena who had always believed the paranormal was just a story device to scare people. That was until she encountered something in her own home that she could not explain. It all started when Lena and her boyfriend Dylan moved into an old two-story house in a quiet, secluded town. The house, built in the 1920s, was beautiful but had an eerie charm to it. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and long, dark hallways that seemed to stretch forever. The locals whispered that something was wrong with the house, but they only ever offered vague warnings, like keep to the ground floor at night. Lena laughed off the rumors. She had always been the skeptic, brushing off ghost stories as nonsense, but things quickly began to change. It began with small, subtle sounds. Every night at precisely 3 o'clock, Lena would hear what sounded like footsteps coming from the attic. It was strange because they were so distinct, slow, deliberate, and heavy, as though someone were pacing back and forth. Dylan heard them too, but he chalked it up to an old house settling, or maybe rodents. They even brought in an exterminator, but he found no signs of any creatures. Then Lena started seeing things. Shadows would dart across her peripheral vision, especially in the evenings when the house was quiet. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but there was one night when she could no longer ignore it. She was washing dishes, her back to the hallway, when she saw a figure standing in the doorway in the reflection of the kitchen window. It looked like a woman with tangled hair, her face obscured in darkness. Lena gasped and spun around, but there was no one there, just the cold, empty hallway. Her sleep became disturbed by vivid nightmares. Every night, she found herself trapped in the house's attic in her dreams, unable to leave. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. Each time, the clock read exactly 3:33 a.m. One night, after yet another nightmare, she decided she had to confront her fear. She needed to know what was going on, so she went up to the attic alone, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder as she climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was dark and filled with dust and cobwebs, but something else hung in the air, a sense of dread that made her skin crawl. As she scanned the room with her flashlight, she noticed strange symbols etched into the wooden beams, markings she had never seen before. They were faded, but they looked almost ritualistic, like something meant to trap or bind. Suddenly she heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling her name, Lena. Panicked, she turned to run back down the stairs, but froze. A figure was standing in the doorway. It was the woman she had seen in the reflection, a translucent skeletal form draped in a tattered, blood-stained dress. Her mouth was open as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. Lena's legs gave way and she fell to the floor, the flashlight rolling from her grasp and casting frantic, swirling shadows around the room. When she finally found the courage to look back, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She felt as if someone's eyes were boring into her, filled with rage. Lena bolted downstairs, locking herself in the bedroom, trembling, clutching her flashlight like it was a lifeline. Dylan, worried about her strange behavior, stayed with her in the room, but the occurrences only intensified. Every night, they heard scratching at the door, as though someone or something was trying to get in. In desperation, Lena decided to do some research on the house's history. She found a local historian who was familiar with the property. The man grew pale when she mentioned the address. He told her the house had belonged to a widow named Eleanor, who had suffered a tragic death. Eleanor's husband had died in an accident, and she had become reclusive, eventually passing away in the house's attic. Rumor had it that she was tormented in her final days, plagued by voices and shadows. Some believed she had summoned something dark, desperate to be reunited with her husband. Haunted by the story, Lena contacted a medium to try and communicate with whatever spirit was in the house. The medium performed a ritual in the attic, attempting to make contact. Suddenly, she went pale, eyes wide, and whispered, "She's here. She's angry." Then the medium let out a scream, her voice shaking the walls, and collapsed to the floor. She was rushed to the hospital and later reported that she had seen a woman with hollow eyes screaming silently, trapped in the attic. The final straw came one stormy night. Lena woke up to see the woman standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes burning with hatred. She was closer than ever, her face twisted and contorted in agony. The air was frigid, and Lena felt like she couldn't breathe, as though an invisible hand was pressing down on her chest. She felt her life draining, slipping away with every second she remained frozen in fear. Just as Lena was about to lose consciousness, Dylan burst into the room, breaking whatever spell had held her captive. The figure vanished, leaving Lena gasping for air. That night, they left the house for good, never looking back. They sold the house at a loss to someone who wasn't from town and who had never heard the stories. Months later, Lena received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph taken from the attic showing a faint figure staring out from the darkness, a woman with empty, hollow eyes, her mouth open in a silent scream. There was an elderly woman named Agnes who lived alone in a small cottage near the woods. She had no family nearby, and her days were spent in solitude. But Agnes had one peculiar hobby. She collected dolls, hundreds of them, each one more unsettling than the last. Some were chipped and worn, with glass eyes that glistened in the dim light. Others had frozen expressions of horror, smiles stretched too wide or mouths sewn shut. They filled every corner of her home, watching her as she went about her day. One particularly cold winter night, Agnes heard a faint knock on her door. Startled, she checked the time. It was almost midnight, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Her hand trembled as she opened the door, only to find the snow-covered doorstep empty. She closed the door, muttering to herself, and went back to her knitting. But the moment she sat down, the knock came again, louder this time. And again, no one was there. Over the next few nights, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, always around midnight. Agnes tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Her dolls seemed to stare at her with more intensity, their eyes glinting in the dim light. One night, she woke to the sound of tiny footsteps shuffling through the house, a soft scraping that echoed down the hallway. She lay still, clutching her blankets, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside her bedroom door. Desperate, Agnes decided to lock all her dolls in the attic. She gathered them up, one by one, placing them in old wooden crates and sealing the attic door with a heavy padlock. That night, for the first time in weeks, there was no knocking. She thought she could finally get a good night's sleep. But around 3 a.m., Agnes woke to a faint creaking noise. She realized it was coming from above her, the attic. She heard the scraping of wood as though something was shifting inside. The sound grew louder, and then she heard a low, whispering chant coming from the attic, in voices so soft and sinister that they barely sounded human. Her blood ran cold as she recognized some of the words, repeated over and over, "Let us out!" Agnes tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But night after night, the whispers grew louder, filling her ears like a swarm of insects. Soon the voices were calling her name in 100 different tones. Children's voices, men's voices, some guttural and inhuman. They sounded desperate, angry, pleading, whining. One night, she could take it no longer. She climbed the creaky staircase, holding a candle that flickered with each step. The air grew thick and cold as she reached the attic door, and a foul stench seeped out from the cracks. Her hands shook as she unlatched the padlock, feeling as though 100 eyes were watching her from within. She opened the door, and the silence that followed was deafening. The crates lay exactly as she'd left them, but something felt wrong. She heard a faint giggle from behind her. Whipping around, she saw one of her dolls sitting at the top of the stairs, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. She hadn't brought that one up yet. Heart pounding, she turned back to the crates, and slowly she opened one. Inside was her favorite doll, a delicate porcelain figure with a glassy smile, but her eyes had been replaced with two black, empty holes, as though they had been gouged out. Agnes recoiled, and as she did, she heard the faintest sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a heartbeat. She glanced around, but she was alone. Then she felt something cold and small grip her ankle. She gasped, looking down to see one of the dolls from the attic clasping her leg, its glass eyes reflecting the candlelight, its tiny mouth twisted into a grin. Panicking, she stumbled backward, the doll's grip loosening, just as she heard more tiny footsteps moving toward her. The other dolls were crawling out of the crates, their faces twisted in rage, each one coming alive as if drawn to her terror. Agnes bolted for the stairs, but the dolls followed, dragging themselves across the floor, whispering her name, their voices now louder, more demanding. Agnes, stay with us. Stay forever. She reached the stairs and dashed down, locking the attic door behind her. But the knocking started up again, louder than ever, as the dolls pounded against the door from the other side. Exhausted and terrified, Agnes barricaded herself in her bedroom, listening to the relentless thumping that lasted until dawn. She knew she couldn't stay there another night, so she packed a bag and fled the house, leaving everything behind. But as she walked away from the cottage, she noticed a small bundle wrapped in cloth at the end of her driveway. It was one of her dolls, the porcelain one with the black, empty eyes, and beneath it was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You can't leave us, Agnes. We belong to you." Agnes disappeared that winter, her cottage abandoned, her fate a mystery. Some say her spirit haunts the house, trapped alongside the dolls she collected. And if you visit the cottage late at night, you might hear her voice, soft, pleading, calling your name, begging for someone to set her free. There was a man named Tom who had always been drawn to abandoned places. He loved exploring old buildings and forgotten towns, photographing the decay and imagining the lives of the people who once lived there. One evening, he learned of an abandoned hospital hidden deep in the woods, miles from any sign of civilization. Rumor had it that the hospital had closed under mysterious circumstances and had been left to rot, its hallways frozen in time. Intrigued, Tom decided he had to see it for himself. He arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. The hospital loomed in the distance, its walls cracked and its windows shattered. Ivy crept up the brickwork, and the silence surrounding it was so complete that even his own footsteps felt too loud. Pushing open the rusted front doors, he stepped into the darkened lobby. The smell of mold and decay filled the air, and he could feel a chill creeping up his spine, but he ignored it. He had been to many eerie places. This was no different, or so he thought. As he walked down the main corridor, his flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. He reached an old nurse's station, where tattered medical records lay scattered across the counter, their ink faded but still legible. One file caught his eye. It was dated October 1956, the last year the hospital had been open. The notes mentioned a patient named Margaret who had suffered from severe hallucinations. "She claims to see figures in the darkness," the record read, "but there is no one there." Tom felt a prickle of unease, but brushed it off. As he turned to leave the station, he heard a soft scraping sound coming from down the hallway. He froze, listening. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a dragging, shuffling noise that grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. Heart pounding, he aimed his flashlight down the hall, but the beam cut only through thick darkness. Deciding to investigate, he followed the sound, his footsteps echoing alongside the shuffling. It led him to the old psychiatric wing, where the walls were scrawled with desperate messages. "Don't listen to them. They're coming. Get out." The writing was erratic, almost childlike, as though written by someone in a frantic hurry. He turned a corner and found himself in a hallway lined with locked doors, each one marked with a patient's name. He read the names as he passed. Robertson, Klein, Thatcher, Margaret. Her door was slightly ajar, unlike the others, and his flashlight flickered again as he approached it. Inside, the room was almost empty, save for an old bed frame and a single chair facing the corner. Something about the room felt wrong, like the air was thicker, charged with a strange energy. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside, and as he did, his flashlight suddenly died, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. He cursed under his breath, smacking the flashlight, when he heard something. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a hiss, but it grew louder, forming words. "Why are you here?" a voice whispered, soft and menacing. It sounded close, too close, right next to his ear. Tom stumbled backward, heart racing, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. He fumbled for his phone to use its light, but as he lifted it, the screen blinked, then died, leaving him in total darkness. The whispering continued, growing louder, until it sounded like a chorus of voices surrounding him. Some voices were pleading, others angry, all overlapping, creating a maddening cacophony. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the voices seeped through, each one saying the same thing: "We're still here." The air grew colder, and he felt a presence in the room, something standing just behind him. He was too afraid to turn, but he felt a cold hand graze his shoulder, fingers pressing down, unrelenting. He broke into a run, slamming his shoulder against the door until it finally gave way, sending him stumbling back into the hallway. But the hospital had changed. The hallway was no longer empty. Faint figures lined the walls, each one barely more than a shadow, their faces twisted in anguish. They stared at him with hollow eyes as he ran past, their whispers filling the air, calling his name. He reached the main entrance, but the doors wouldn't budge. Desperate, he turned back, trying to find another way out. The whispers became screams, piercing, relentless cries that echoed through the halls. He felt like he was losing his mind, his vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in around him. He stumbled into what looked like the old surgical wing, where broken equipment lay scattered on the floor. In the center of the room was an operating table, stained and rusted, with restraints still fastened to the sides. The smell of rot was overwhelming. Suddenly, the shadows moved closer, pressing in, their faces clearer now. Patients, doctors, nurses, all trapped in expressions of horror and pain. And standing among them was a woman with hollow eyes and a hospital gown stained with blood. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she raised a skeletal hand and pointed directly at him. "You don't belong here," she rasped, her voice a guttural growl. Tom stumbled back, tripping over a piece of debris. He landed hard, the shadows closing in around him, their hands reaching out, cold fingers brushing against his skin. Just as he felt their icy grip tightening, his flashlight flickered back on, casting a weak beam of light that drove the shadows back. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not looking back, not stopping until he burst out of the hospital and into the freezing night air. He didn't stop running until he was back at his car. Heart pounding, mind racing. As he drove away, he glanced back, and in his rearview mirror, he saw them. The shadows standing at the hospital entrance, watching him with hollow eyes as their mouths moving in silent screams. He never returned to the hospital, but the nightmares never left him. Every night, he dreams of that place, trapped in the darkness, surrounded by those voices, those faces. And each morning he wakes with scratches on his arms, as though their fingers had found him in his sleep, reminding him that they're still there, waiting, watching, wanting him back.